Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, starting my speech in three, two, one. Panel, whenever we talk about like voting or the candidates or any political party, we can see a lot of stuff always going on, a lot of drama and everything. But what we need to do is we need to totally focus on, if we talk about the political party, exactly in which way, which which candidate is exactly will be more beneficial for them, and exactly in which way if they go that is going to be more a beneficial way for them. And if we talk about the Republican Party, obviously Trump is not the one. So in this scenario, that it is the electoral interest of the National Republican Party to strongly oppose Donald Trump's primary campaign. Speaker, first thing we need to notice the whole motion. It's we are going to think is from the from the perspective of the National Republican Party, like in which way if they oppose or if they do not, in which way that is going to be more beneficial for them, and is and if they don't do so, is it going to harm them a lot? Is it going to cost them a lot? Donald Trump's primary campaign. So if we talk about the Republican Party, we can clearly see there are two kinds of people under even in the same team, that's moderate to moderately conservative Republicans and the ultra national or ultra racist kind of Republicans who support Trump's a lot. And the first kind of people, they are the one that they have like their ideologies kind of do not match to Trump's. So there's a lot of reason why whenever they talk about whenever there's Trump, there's a lot of even Republicans who do not support them, and there's a majority of people who do not like Trump. So there are main four reasons like exactly why they do not run. First of all, look, whenever we have seen Trump, we have seen him extremely pushing anti-abortion law. So as there are a lot of moderate to moderately conservative Republicans, there are even a majority of people in even in their own party that they are kind of conservative, and whenever Trump is extremely pushing anti-abortion laws, this is are obviously causing something that do not they do not like him. The second thing, Trump tried to put a lot of burden of the last election. Like if he loses, even though he says so many things publicly into the media, and this kind of things, whenever he tells in the media or in front of the whole world, the liabilities come to the political party. Like any candidate if from the Republican Party, if they say any statement publicly to the media, to the world, the whole burden is on the political party. So if they say something that's so much inappropriate, or if they say something that doesn't make sense, or like attack something, the political party, they have to so take the liabilities, and this kind of liabilities are costing the Republican and party so much more, because whenever he loses an election, he says like the everything is a scam and all this kind of things. The next thing, look, non Trump have this tendency, like most of the time he says like non-American parties tries to take the place, like he promotes racism and this kind of things, like he shows so much, he tries to push so much nationalism, like whenever any candidate that is like trying to stand up, and his origin is not from like America, he tries to show everyone that this person, they are not American, they are outsiders, and they are taking our place and everything. And whenever he says this kind of things, this creates so much negative impact. And whenever he says this kind of statement, and he tries to instigate people so much more about it, this kind of things are causing so much harm. And the fourth thing, uh, uh, and the next thing is, and this is also going to cost the Republican Party so much more. And look, whenever Donald Trump is doing all of everything, this is like costing Donald Trump losing everyone. Like each day he's stating this kind of states when are showing this kind of behavior, everything, and he has even earned that is something that he has start losing. Look, the moderate and the swing states, they need to be in his favor. Like the red states are going to obviously vote the red, and if the blue states are going to vote the blue, still there are some kind of states that they need to have those states in his favor. So he needs to convince this kind of states people that he is someone that their ideal candidate and he is the best fit for everyone. But as he is doing this kind of stuff, this is something that is harming not just his image, it's also harming the Republicans' image. And in this kind of situation, once Biden's popularity like haven't decreased, but Trump's popularity is like harming a lot. Like even though we have seen the corona period, we have the never-ending China's problem and everything, but we can clearly see that Joe Biden's popularity that was before that it wasn't so much affected because of this kind of thing. But instead, what in Trump's case, what we can see, like Trump is moving away from the goals that the Republican party's people they have like imagined or they have planned. So this kind of things are not just creating any problem outside the political party. This is so much. These are things are creating problem even inside the party. So whenever there's any political party, they have some common goals, they have some common ideologies that they think that this needs to be implemented. But whenever there's someone that he's like conflicting everything of this, he's not just like affecting the party's image politically, he's creating a lot of conflict internally, and this is also going to create the unbalance inside the party. And in this kind of situation, they need to like the Republican Party, even though they need to put some kind of Trumpism, but not exactly Trump, because Trump is Trump's aggression and everything that is causing so much. There are more suitable candidates like Ron DeSantis or anyone. And the amount of political baggage that Trump is causing, that's something that a Republican, that's very heavy on the Republican Party. So whenever Trump is saying something and he is like putting any public statement or he is saying something, that is something that is costing the Republican Party so much political cost. Because look, whenever he says this kind of things, the political party have to like invest their money, and they have to like run so many, they have to prove, they have to give analysis, like even though he's saying this kind of thing in this kind of point, these things are correct, or this is why he's saying things. So whenever this kind of things is happening, this is creating so much heavy political baggage on the Republican Party. And if you don't oppose the Trump's campaign, these things are something that is keep going to happen, and this is going to hamper the Republican Party so much. And if you don't oppose the Trump's campaign, other capable candidates from the same party, they're obviously going to rise up, like Ron DeSantis or everyone, and they're going to destroy their own credibility. Because look, in 2016 in election, we have seen how the strength of Republican Party was together, and it was so much hard for the Democratic Party to overcome that. But in this case, if we don't stop the Trump's election and campaign, and when their own credibility is going to get destroyed, this is something that is going to harm their party so much, and it will be totally impossible for our party to stand out among all the parties. So if you think from the Republican Party's interest and their perspective, strongly opposing the Trump's primary campus is the best solution. Thank you.
All right. I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to continue the case for side negative, I'd like to invite the first negative speaker. Here.
Great. Can I check I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Even if this affirmative team could successfully prove to you that Trump is bad, or even that Trump would be an unpopular candidate, they never actually met this burden in the debate, that it would be in the interest of the Republican Party to oppose him in the primary, right? Because the opposition to Trump is something that creates a whole lot of side effects, a whole lot of backlash that rip the party apart. It means that no matter who ends up winning that Republican primary, you're in a worse position to go for the general election at the end of the election cycle. So 4 things I'm going to do. Firstly, some setup. Secondly, I'm going to explain why you're going to get guaranteed harms and disunity in the party, regardless of who wins the primary. Thirdly, I'm going to explain what happens if Trump wins the primary despite this opposition. Obviously, very bad for affirmative team. And finally, I'm going to say, well, even if Trump loses the primary and so AF is successful, why that is actually much worse for Republican Party's electoral prospects. So firstly, in setup, just the burden on affirmative team is to strongly oppose everything that Trump does here. On negative, we are going to take the higher burden available to us. We're going to actively support Trump. We think he's a good candidate for us to win the elections. What are the interests of the Republican Party? Obviously, winning the elections is the most important thing, but notably, that's not the primary one, right? That's the presidential election, but also down ballot elections like the Senate and the House elections. Secondly, though, this leadership also probably cares about keeping their own seats in particular. Sort of your more traditional politicians like Mitch McConnell don't want to get voted out. So firstly, why are you going to why is it guaranteed that you're going to get disunity regardless of who wins? The first thing I want to establish here is a set of reasons why Trump currently, as is true, has a huge advantage in electoral polling and primary polling over his nearest competitor, which isn't mentioned in this app case, but we assume is Ron DeSantis, right? Who's the only other person who's been shown as potentially could be a candidate that is available. If they want to prop someone else, that's fine. We also think Trump would have advantage over this nobody. So what are some reasons? Firstly, he obviously has name recognition, right? He was the president for 4 years. Everyone knows who Trump is. Broadly, the Republicans voted for him, right? Particularly Ron DeSantis, his opposition, only has notoriety in Florida, has never been tested outside of that governor role. Secondly, he is just very personally popular. That is for a bunch of structural reasons. Firstly, because he owned Clinton and the Democratic establishment. Secondly, because he wasn't afraid to speak out against Republicans that disagreed with him, which means that voters often felt inspired by his message. But thirdly, because even if you didn't like him, he was able to get Supreme Court justices onto the court, and they were able to do things that were really good for Republican voters. Thirdly, Trump has a huge amount of media control. He has lots of influence over Fox News. He gets called in all the time. He has lots of ability to sway the way that voters, alter their mindset. But finally, he just has a huge amount of internal control over the party, right? His endorsements overwhelmingly decided who won the midterm primaries in the most recent midterms for the Republican Party. And I would note that all but one of the Republicans that voted for his impeachment lost their house in the most recent House seat in the most recent midterm election. So Trump clearly has a lot of sway within the Republican Party. If you blanketly oppose him, it is likely it's going to create a lot of resentment. It's going to create a lot of a lot of distrust. What is the affirmative team's material here? They say lots of people don't like Trump, but the reasons they give are wrong and non-comparative, right? Being anti-abortion is a Republican position. It's not a Trump position. And obviously the Republican Party needs to win evangelicals and the sort of fundamentalists who support this sort of thing. They say, well, the party will be responsible for Trump's lies, but overwhelmingly Trump gets away with his lies. And even when he doesn't, it reflects on him rather than the party more broadly. But I would note, even if you accepted every single line of that affirmative case, almost all those criticisms are also true of Ron DeSantis, right? Like he's equally extreme in many of these measures. It's unclear why they would be any better on those issues. So next thing I'm going to prove under this point is that opposing him tears the party apart. The first reason for this is it just creates division within the party. That is, maybe the party leadership is united in opposing him, but far-right representatives like the new House Speaker Kevin McCarthy are probably unlikely to get on board with that train. That means you're going to get mixed messaging and signals throughout the party to voters. Secondly, Trump has a revealed preference for personal attacks. He called Ted Cruz's wife ugly. He called Marco Rubio a cuck. There's lots of things that Trump will do, to directly attack his enemies. Thirdly, your primary campaign necessarily requires negative ads on the other candidates. That's on both candidates from both sides of the Republican primary, which means it's going to last longer. The longer it lasts, the worse it gets in terms of the public's image of them. Fourthly, Trump has the stop the seal narrative, which means he will, say that any loss that happens actually wasn't his fault. I would note in our world, what is likely to happen is Trump wins the first few primary state elections. That is, he wins Iowa, he wins North Hampshire, and he wins Super Tuesday, which means that the primary is over in like February and March, right? You don't have that long drawn out campaign, and that's because he builds momentum. It's a quick, easy surrender. But on their side of the house, it necessarily lasts a long time, even if Trump loses, which means even if they end up getting a better candidate, there are definite harms. What are those harms? Firstly, Firstly, a huge opportunity cost in funding you've spent on the primary and attacking other Republicans instead of attacking Democrats in the general election. Secondly, all the divisions within the party that I've just previously talked about. But thirdly, because voters are exposed to ads for months about why Republicans are bad, all voters see those ads, which means the Democrats very easy for them to capitalize on it, given how united the Democratic Party is behind Biden. So regardless of who wins the primary, it's terrible for your party. Why will Trump what happens if Trump wins the primary anyway? And I would note for the reasons we give above, it is more likely that this happens. Obviously, we think there's a bunch of reasons why he's likely to lose the general election to Democrats. Even if he doesn't, it's likely to be more narrow. That means you're more likely to lose the Senate and stuff. That's also bad. So what are the reasons of this? Firstly, Trump is a narcissist, right? That means he sees all these attacks as a personal attack against him, which means he's not likely to just fall in line, get behind the Republican Party. If he wins, right, he's going to, try to root out those Republican, the people who've opposed him. Secondly, he just backtracked. The Republican Party will look like it's backtracked heaps, right? You've just spent a year saying Trump is bad, and now Trump wins, and you have to try and convince Democratic voters, oh, actually, Trump is a good person that you should vote for. Thirdly, you lose confidence from donors because you're flip-flopping on which candidates you prefer all the time, but also you're just more likely to lose the sets of voters that Trump, that wouldn't vote for Trump, right? So you lose your presidential and your down ballot seats. Even if you don't lose that election, in the long term, Trump becomes much more radical, right? Because he is now in charge of the Republican Party, but the Republican Party has told him that they don't like him. So he has huge incentives to disempower that party leadership and make it more of a personal brand, even if he wins that election. But even in affirmative team's best case, let's say Trump loses the primary because of your opposition. Why is that bad? Firstly, very simply, it is incredibly likely that Trump will continue to attack the Republican Party. He's taken it as a personal attack. He doesn't have any loyalty to the party. He was perfectly happy to root them out in 2016. And that means, of course, he's going to continue to throw shit and mudslinging at you across the sidelines. But more importantly, he's almost certainly going to run as a third party, not on the Republican ticket, just independently. That is for a set of reasons. Firstly, because he needs the presidency to immunize and pardon himself from the lawsuits and the prosecutions that are going against him and his family members in the status quo. The alternative for him is running or going to jail, right? He's going to run regardless. Secondly, he's old and delusional. Even if he might not have a rational chance of winning, he's going to try anyway. And that means even if he only has a small chance, he will take it. Thirdly, he's rich. He can self-fund his campaign. He doesn't require on the Republican Party membership mechanisms. Fourthly, he just craves attention, which means he's likely to do it even if he doesn't think it's going to be successful. But even if you don't think he's going to run a third-party campaign, obviously, if he runs a third-party campaign, that's terrible, right? Because you now have two Republican candidates, you split the vote, Joe Biden wins easy. But even if he doesn't, you just lose a set of voters that are loyal to Trump. Those are swing voters in the Rust Belt. Those are Hispanic voters in the South and in Florida. Those people would only vote for Trump. Now that he's not your candidate, they would never vote for the Republican Party. Biden wins. You've lost all your goals. Congratulations.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for the speech. In order to continue the case for side affirmative, I'd like to invite the second affirmative speaker. Here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Trump's promised red wave never happened. The only red wave that ever happened was in Florida, and the man behind it was Ron DeSantis. They clearly did not contextualize and understand the political climate that happened after Trump lost, which is why we're going to put forward that framing, which is extremely important in this debate. We think that Biden has not lost as much as the Republican Party would have hoped. He still owns the Senate and has a significant chunk of seats in the House of Representatives, despite the fact that the US is going through so much inflation, things like the aggressiveness of Russia towards Ukraine and the ever-growing tensions with China, right? We think that on that scenario, the kinds of severe anti-Trumpism that Biden has been running as a focal point of his political identity after getting elected is significant enough of an incentive for swing voters to not vote for Trump, because they know that Trump has previously lost to Biden, and they also know that the kinds of primaries that he's running right now aren't just things that align with their political interests in the first place. Which means we think that because of this like fractured political climate that exists right now, it is within the electoral interest of the Republican Party to not only like win more seats, yes, we agree, but also in the long term, they have to pick a candidate that has less political cost to prop up. We think in that scenario, Ron DeSantis is the best option that you have right now. And note, he's going to win a significant amount of supporters, regardless of whether or not you support Trump or you oppose him. So we don't really understand why that fracturing that they talk about that only exists under our side of the house is not symmetric, because we think that even if you don't do anything as a Republican Party, Trump will still come to blows against Ron DeSantis. Why do we think then, if you have these two candidates, Ron DeSantis on one side and Trump on the other side, why do we think that opposing Trump is something that the Republican Party should do? Two reasons. Number one, without Trump, even if he still holds a significant amount of power, and this is us taking them at their absolute best case, we still think that he is slowly losing power, as shown by his Democratic primaries campaign, that is statistically been shown to fail based on its projections, and that the only red wave that happened was in Florida, which was headed by Ron DeSantis. There are four reasons why this campaign has failed. Number one, Trump's MAGA movement has aggressively endorsed anti-abortion laws in a rhetoric that has been extremely sexist and misogynistic, which means that the kinds of Midwestern white voters that were a significant part of Trump's winning coalition in 2016 suddenly don't want to vote for him right now. He's alienating a large part of his voter base. Secondarily, they tout narratives such as the great replacement. The fact that, like anti-Americans, for example, Asian Americans or people who aren't Americans, are siding with woke liberals and trying to replace white Americans from systems of governance. This is extremely sexist, and it also alienates a significant chunk of, let's say, Black individuals or Hispanic individuals who probably previously also voted for Trump to begin with. Thirdly, he's saying that the election was a scam. Look, even if Trump isn't alienating a significant chunk of his previous voter base, saying the elections were a scam is an enormous loss of faith that the voters have, because they themselves feel like their votes don't even matter. But lastly, and more importantly, their idea on media manipulation is just statistically untrue. Rupert Murdoch literally left support from Donald Trump because he feels like Trump isn't the best candidate to support in and of themselves. For all these reasons, we think that even if Trump holds a significant amount of power right now, he's losing that power, and it's on that gradual trend of losing even more and more power. We don't think it is better long term to support him. What are the harms of supporting him then? Number one, we think that the internal fracturing that is likely going to happen under their side of the house is going to make things significantly worse. I'll take them at their best case. Let's say that they don't support Trump and they just don't do anything, okay? We think that in the vast majority of instances, probabilistically speaking, Ron DeSantis is going to be up against Donald Trump for the presidential candidacy, right? Which means that there's going to be a significant fracturing between the Trump, between the Trump acolytes within the Republican Party and the people who support Ron DeSantis to begin with. Why is this significantly worse under their side of the house? Three reasons. Number one, we think that DeSantis is a more moderate version of Trumpism. We think that DeSantis is extremely more like constructive and policy driven, as opposed to Donald Trump being more rhetorical by their own characterization. That is the reason why he was able to win Florida, because the people in Florida feel like he is a champion and a challenger against the woke liberal agenda, but he was also able to garner support in the post-pandemic world by saying that you should be free and not wear any masks, right? So DeSantis knows that you can't just rely on rhetoric, you also need to rely on policies and mechanistic reasons in order to win votes, which means that we think that the mudslinging that they're going to talk about as if we oppose Trump is going to happen anyway if Ron DeSantis owns a significant number of supporters and he tries to say that I'm going to beat Trump at his own game. It's probably likely that Trump is going to utilize the things that he's historically good at, which, by the way, aren't policies or constructive mechanisms. It's mudslinging. It's making the other person look bad. What happens then? If you don't strongly oppose him, it means that Trump can literally go unchecked. At least under our side of the house, even in our absolute worst case, we can devote a significant chunk of resources to prevent that vitriolic rhetoric from fracturing the entire Republican Party, given that Ron DeSantis is likely going to have a significant amount of supporters, and he can galvanize all of the supporters to make sure that Trump isn't able to completely ruin the party in and of themselves, right? Why do we think that fracturing then is extremely horrible under their side of the house? Because it results in a lot of internal conflict, which means you have less time to prop up a good campaign to fight back against Joe Joe Biden and win the presidential election, right? But more importantly, Democrats can also capitalize on this, right? They can say that, look, there is internal conflict within the Republican Party. You should probably vote for us instead. But lastly, and more importantly, look, last year, Republicans won primarily because of the unity within their own party, right? Every single person was behind Trump, right? So we think that aggressively opposing Trump, even if it means he creates a separate third party and utilizing all the resources under Ron DeSantis is much better because it creates a more united Republican Party, which is better able to win against Joe Biden. The reason why the Democrats lost was because they were significantly fractured between Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders, right? Or Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders. But lastly, why do we think that even on even in a vacuum, this is going to make it extremely harder for the Republican Party to win if they support Trump, right? Three reasons. Number one, political baggage. We think that in order to support Trump or in order to not oppose Trump, you need to use a lot of resources to defend Trump's viewpoints. So regardless of whether or not you support Trump, if Trump eventually wins the primaries and becomes a presidential candidate, you need to waste enormous amounts of analytics, smear campaigns, media manipulation, and immense political costs to defend the things he's saying. The fact that the election is a scam, the fact that the great replacement is real, all of these things have enormous amounts of political costs for the Republican Party to actually justify and defend, and they're still not free from attacks that are likely going to come from the Democrats, which again shift information away from their primary political agenda, which is to say that Trump is still a voice of the voiceless, right? But secondarily, even if you're able to do this, even if there's no political cost of propping up Donald Trump, what do you get out of it? You get rhetorical and not mechanistic forms of development, which means that the kinds of voter fatigue which we're experiencing right now and the loss of faith from Trump saying that the election is a scam is going to make it extremely difficult for you to win those extremely important moderate and swing votes, right? But more importantly, we think that the fact that Trump has essentially fractured and antagonized a significant chunk of his voter base, as evidenced by him not winning his projected victories in the primary campaign or the primary elections, means that even if you were able to prop him up in power, even if you were to support him, or even if you were not to do anything and him being in power anyway, we don't think it is extremely likely that you're going to win and have a good candidate in and of themselves. For all these reasons, I've never been prouder to propose.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to continue the case for side negative, I'd like to invite the second negative speaker. Here.
All right, give me just a second to set up all my stuff. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to begin the speech by being insanely charitable in an undeserving way to this team. Let's take the absolute worst case for us and say that maybe Trump does successfully get stopped from winning the primaries. Why are we willing to accept that, and why is it better? And that's for a list of substantive we give you at will that goes virtually entirely unresponded to. Firstly, we explained that this likely means Trump runs as an independent. Their only response to this is that now you have a more united party because all the Trump voters leave and follow him. The issue is if your united party is more united, but now half its size, it's obviously massively smaller than the Democratic Party. So you immediately lose that election and miss out on the opportunity of 4 more years of Republican control and instead have a Democrat in power who can undo all of your policy and continue to make it harder for you to achieve policy in the future. Secondly, we explained that even if he doesn't run as an independent, he still does things like attack the party. He undermines the other candidates in the elections, undermines Ron DeSantis, and he does things like question the legitimacy of the primaries in the same way that he did when he lost the presidential election to Joe Biden. Which means even in a world in which he doesn't run as an independent, you still are far less likely to win as a consequence of having Trump, who we explain has a massive motivated base and a willingness to engage in opposition to the Republican Party out there to attack you and your electoral interests. And thirdly, we explain that even if neither of those things happen, Trump doesn't run as an independent, he doesn't try to undermine your party, you still have a massive drawn out primary in which you've spent a bunch of money putting out attack ads on Republicans, attack ads on Republican principles, many of which Ron DeSantis now has to stand behind. And you've had Trump himself funding a bunch of attack ads against Ron DeSantis, where previously, by supporting one candidate and having a quick primary that Trump wins easily after Super Tuesday, you now avoid all of those things. So in the absolute worst case for us, in their world, where Trump does successfully get stopped, clearly that is a harm we are easily able to flip. Moving on then, the part of this case where they actually have some substantive. And being super charitable again, why is Trump winning not a harm? They give you 3 reasons why Trump is a bad candidate. Firstly, they claim that he is anti-abortion. He doesn't actually make a big issue of abortion. You need to be comparative. Ron DeSantis is insanely anti-abortion. All of the things that Trump did on the national level to oppose abortion, Ron DeSantis has been doing for much longer in a much harsher way in Florida. Look at Florida's abortion laws. Consider that platform being expanded to the entirety of the United States. If you think Trump is anti-abortion and that's bad, obviously you should consider the same thing to be even more true of Ron DeSantis. But secondly, Republican candidates need to be anti-abortion. That's because being anti-abortion has been the basis of their platform for decades. They're required to do that in order to get things like funding from their donors and to be consistent with their previous campaigns. So all Republican candidates are likely to be anti-abortion. Second claim they make, he denied the election and therefore is unable to get rid of that baggage. Firstly, that is a real, genuine belief of many Republicans. Propping that up means that you are able to get a motivated base. But secondly, engaging in that kind of election denialism rhetoric means that they are able to do things like help Republican states do things like engage in electoral reform, like gerrymandering, like things like stopping mail-in voting, like things voter ID laws, all of which advantage Republican candidates. And maybe all of those things are immoral, but they are things that Trump is able to do when he does things like deny the election that help the Republicans' electoral interests. And in an active debate, that's what we care about. Third claim they make then is that he's racist and nationalistic. Firstly, that is a core part of his base that gets people fired up and was successful when he beat Hillary Clinton, but it's also something that's equally true of Ron DeSantis. All the reasons they give, therefore, why Trump is a bad candidate don't particularly stand. But secondly, none of this really matters because what we need to do in this debate is be comparative to Ron DeSantis. And this is something that they absolutely completely fall apart on because they seem to not understand at all who Ron DeSantis is and what he stands for. Firstly, he is stronger on abortion, nationalism, and racism and homophobia than Donald Trump ever was in the first place. So you think all of those things make a bad presidential candidate. Why would you pick Ron DeSantis, who's worse on all of those things? Look at the way that Florida has done things like change the curriculum to be anti-gay, done things like have really strict abortion laws, done things like ban immigrants. All of those things are incredibly racist, homophobic, and nationalistic. And therefore, Ron DeSantis, if you care about that sort of thing, is comparatively far worse. Secondly, he's just a much less charismatic candidate. He can't do things like have good, powerful rhetoric that gets people involved. He's just a worse public speaker. And thirdly, he just isn't super well known. He hasn't done any elections outside of Florida. The people of America aren't as familiar with him as they are with Donald Trump. He doesn't have as much of an existing base. Then they get out at second and actually try and defend why Ron DeSantis is a good candidate. Firstly, they try to claim that he has election success in Florida, therefore that success would translate to the rest of America. But there's obviously a huge mechanistic leap that occurs there. Just because he was successful in Florida doesn't mean that he's going to be successful on the national stage. The important reason that, as we explained to you at will, the makeup of Florida's demographic is highly favorable to Republicans, firstly because it's been massively gerrymandered in favor of Republicans, but also because the voters in Florida are far more conservative than voters more broadly in the majority of swing states that they need to be that the Republican Party needs to win in order to get the presidential candidate. But I'd also note that that success that Ron DeSantis was able to achieve in Florida was done on a platform that was even more homophobic, more racist, more nationalistic than Trump's platform. So if you think that he was successful because he was successful in Florida, Trump's platform would equally be successful in the rest of the nation. Second claim they make then about Ron DeSantis is that he has lots of supporters and you'll be able to weaponize those supporters against Trump. Firstly, that support is isolated to Florida, whereas Trump's support is spread across the rest of the nation, which means that in a national election, Ron DeSantis' ability to weaponize his supporters against the opposite candidate would be far weaker than the alternative, which would be Trump running as an independent or attacking your party. Obviously, we would rather have Ron DeSantis undermining the party than Donald Trump, because Donald Trump has a far more popular, motivated base. Secondly, though, him trying to engage in retribution is against Ron DeSantis' interests. He wants to have continued support from the Republican Party. He wants to have continued election success. He wants to keep getting nominated candidate roles in the future. He wants to be a future presidential candidate, which means that going through a retribution campaign against a Republican presidential candidate would not be in his own interest. If he back Donald Trump's support and the Republican elites back Donald Trump, it's extremely unlikely Ron DeSantis ever does this kind of weaponization of his supporters against Donald Trump in the first place. So at the end of that, even if you believe that Trump is a bad candidate, we proved to you conclusively that Ron DeSantis is the worst candidate for all the same reasons they claim Donald Trump is bad. But secondly, I'm going to be insanely charitable once again and explain why Trump in a vacuum is still actually quite a good election candidate. The first reason for this is that America actually was substantially better under Donald Trump than it was right now. Firstly, that's because of the economy. Inflation was much better. Gas prices were much lower. Employment was much higher. People remember that 4 years ago, the economy was in a better place, and they attribute that to Donald Trump and attribute its failure to Joe Biden. Secondly, he had lots of successful court appointments. He did things like stack the Supreme Court and stack the circuit courts, which enabled Republicans to get a lot of the ideology spread throughout the legislature. C, he said that he had successful policy achievements, things like getting rid of Obamacare, which was extremely unpopular amongst Republicans, and engaging in massive tax reform, which helped get lots of Republicans, especially wealthy, middle to high income Republicans, big tax breaks, were achieved under Donald Trump. Fourthly, COVID actually got worse under Donald Trump. COVID was the only reason he lost the election to Joe Biden. And after Joe Biden became president, COVID cases went up. So it's unclear why that would still carry over to the next election. And fifthly, Republicans perceived America to have a much stronger global standing under Donald Trump because they preferred his rhetoric and his national image. All of that means that if you care about Trump in a vacuum, he is the better candidate. Secondly, though, he just has a more motivated base than any other alternative presidential candidate. He's more important. This is important for votes, especially in non-compulsory voting where you need people to be motivated. Secondly, it's important for campaigning because you need motivated supporters to do things like door knocking. And thirdly, it's important for donations because that's what gets you your funding. Thirdly, though, he has strong funding advantage because he has the capacity to self-fund. And fourthly, he has captured the Republican media. And yes, the Republican media is likely to support Ron DeSantis as well, but there's obviously comparative differences between the two. Fox News' capacity to support Donald Trump is far greater than they would under Ron DeSantis. Now, weigh all of this. Even in our worst case, we are happy to buy Trump becoming the president and flip this because it's clear he is a good presidential candidate in and of himself, but comparatively to Ron DeSantis, he is far, far better. And being in power enables Republicans to do things like advance their policy platform, to do things like fix all the image issues that they have. And even if we don't flip it, we explain this happens on both sides, which means that even if you don't think Trump does become the presidential candidate, he still becomes the nominee and they buy all the harms except worse because the election process is messy. Very, very proud to negate.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for the speech. In order to continue the case for side affirmative, I'd like to invite the third affirmative speaker. Here.
Hi, am I visible and audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, just give me a minute to just organize my note and I'll be good to go. All right. Am I still audible?
Yep.
All right, just give me one more second so that I can set it up in a better way. All right, I hope I'm still visible and audible. So, all right, just starting my timer and starting my speech. All right, starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. They literally strawman our case. Why do I say this? First of all, we never said Ron DeSantis is a liberal individual, right? That is to say, we meant yes, like Ron DeSantis or any other Republican will be against abortion law. There was a nuance, right? The nuance is, yes, we would want some form of Trumpism, but how we frame this sort of narratives is extremely important, right? Why? Because when Trump is talking about abortion, he is using very demeaning and sexist rhetorics. On the contrary, people like Ron DeSantis, much more moderate while explaining this sort of things, is more of policy driven and more structured while explaining all of these things. Now, why is this important? Because of two reasons. Number one, which they never engage with. First of all, most of the people who support Republican Party are one, either in the center or in the center right. uh, that is to say, these sort of people needs like things like this. Why? Because after Trump having this sort of like rhetorical messaging that is extremely sexist and extremely racist, it is not only it is the people who are from the conservative and moderately conservative are concerned about these sort of claims and do not like Trump for uttering this sort of stances, right? Second, you also need to understand why did Trump won against Hillary? Because Hillary was far left, right? That were more into left. That is to say, that is why Trump could win against Hillary by saying, "Oh, like these liberals are becoming way too much liberal." But why can't he win against people like Joe Biden? Because Joe Biden is more of a centric leader, right? So when you have this sort of leader like Donald Trump, who is more into far right, we believe that when there is a candidate against him who is more in the center, we believe at that point the likelihood of Trump beating Joe Biden is less, especially when statistically the popularity of Donald Trump is increasing day by day, and the popularity of Donald Trump is decreasing day by day, right? Now, why is this piece of analysis important? Before I move on to the importance, few responses that I need to provide. Number one, the attacks on ads. First of all, why this is good? Firstly, when you attack Donald Trump, because Donald Trump on ad, what happens is the people who are in the majority, right? The people who are suing, the people who are in the center, they feel they understand. They feel they are understood, right? So one, you are catering toward a large portion of voter base that are likely to vote for you. Second, even if you are like criticizing people like Donald Trump, people like Ron DeSantis have a track record of winning elections in Florida. That is to say, it is also proven it is possible for people like him to even win and persuade people of Florida, right? And he can definitely say and showcase how he's a better candidate and he brings a better policy for the people of Florida, right? All of these things happen in our side of the world. So one, we are catering toward the majority voter base, and at the same time, Ron DeSantis is also extremely capable of winning election in those far right areas as well. Now, why it is good for the Republican Party? Here comes a very important nuance. Number one, even if the Republican Party do not like strongly oppose Donald Trump will talk shit against people like Ron DeSantis and other Republican voters. So the division already exists, right? But but what is bad in their side of the world is the people will know the Republican Party is divided. So there is no unity within the party, right? But in our side of the world, when like the Republican Party strongly opposes, that is to say the other politicians are united and unitedly against one, Joe Biden for sure, but unitedly against people like Donald Trump. Now, why is this important? Because if they do not strongly oppose Donald Trump, two things will happen. Number one, they have to carry the baggage of Donald Trump, the historic baggage, the historic mess that Donald Trump created, both economically and also by stating the very discriminatory words, right? So now in our side of the house, when we are strongly opposing Donald Trump, we are actually moving away from that track record, right? And second of all, even if you don't strongly oppose Donald Trump, what will happen is Donald Trump will still continue talking like the rubbish that he talks, right? That is to say, when you don't strongly oppose Donald Trump, it means that oppose Donald Trump, the baggage that the National Republican Party have to carry and have to defend those like exaggerated, extreme claims, right? So this sort of baggaging happens. But in our side of the world, the Republican Party can tell to the people that no, we understand what is important, we understand what is more moderate, and they can frame and brand themselves in that way. And what is the benefit of branding themselves in that way have been explained through my responses before, right? Now they talk about like if Trump wins, yes, for sure, if Trump wins, that's bad. But what if he like we lose the election, right? If we lose this election, that doesn't really mean Donald Trump is winning, right? That means Biden is winning. Even in our worst case, if conservative the Republican Party makes these sort of claims, two things will happen. Number one, people will know currently the Republican Party is not as extreme that it used to be in the Donald Trump's regime. That the Republican Party is now makes more sense and gave a good fight against Donald Trump, which they are more likely because they have more majority support, and at the same time they have the supporter base from the regions like Florida. So these things happen. So it sets a very good precedence for the next elections as well. That is to say, in the longer run, we have a better chance of winning elections, even in our worst case, if we lose election this year's election, right? Second of all, if we do not do that, and if we do not oppose Trump, it will create more and more baggage to the Republican Party. That is to say, in the longer run, it will be more and more difficult for the Republican Party to win the majoritarian votes, right? Now, the likelihood of Trump winning, the likelihood of who is the best case and worst case, the likelihood of Trump winning is extremely less, because at the very best Trump can win some conservative states, but the likelihood of Trump winning this election is very less. So our worst case, the probability is very less, because one, I have already mentioned the rising popularity of Joe Biden and Joe Biden's centric stance and Donald Trump's more extreme stance. The likelihood of Donald Trump winning is less, where in our side of the house, the likelihood of us winning is much more. So extremely proud to.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to continue the case and to complete the substantive portion from side negative, I'd like to invite the third negative speaker here.
There are two burdens on this affirmative team in this debate. They must first prove that this opposition is likely to work and replace Trump, and then secondly, they must prove that they are more likely to benefit the Republican Party electorally. I'm going to prove in this speech why they fail at both. On the first question, I want to note that it is a necessary precondition for literally 100% of their case, all of their benefits, that this opposition within the Republican Party to Trump is going to actually stop him from becoming your new nominee. If they fail to do that, they literally cannot win the debate. We tell you right from the start a number of structural reasons why Trump is going to be the massive favorite in the primary regardless. Because he speaks on behalf of a lot of the Republican base who like him because he speaks his mind and doesn't respect political correctness. That he has universal name recognition in the primary compared to DeSantis, who is focused in Florida. Because he has run national campaigns before where Ron DeSantis is limited to Florida. Because he has internal party control and his endorsement is powerful. Because he has a well-established media control and media image within things like Fox News. And the only response we get to this is, well, Trump didn't do too well in the midterms and the Republican Party didn't have a red wave, so therefore they need to ditch Trump. But there are two problems with this. Firstly, this completely ignores the Republican base itself, who have spent the past 8 years being told by conservative leaders and conservative media that they trust, and social media echo chambers and getting radicalized by things like COVID lockdowns, who have been telling them that Trump is the best president the US has ever had, that they love Trump, that they feel he represents them, that they feel he is in touch with their concerns and speaks to their needs. They love Trump and they are going to continue to back him in huge numbers regardless, noting that it's particularly the case when you consider things like stop the steal narratives. These people who make up up the base of the Conservative Party, of the Republican Party, who vote in primary Republican elections are ones who don't believe that Trump ever lost. They think the red wave didn't happen because the Democrats faked the election. They don't think Trump is a loser. They think he is a winner. They think he's the only thing standing between them and the deep state. So they are obviously going to continue to love him and back him in huge numbers. He has institutional loyalty to himself in a way that Ron DeSantis or other Republican figures do not. So clearly this endorsement will not work. But secondly, let's take him at their best. Even if you assume that Ron DeSantis does have some momentum and that there is some reason to believe Trump's power might be waning, he starts off from such an advantage because he has all the fundraising advantage. He has the experience. He has the national name recognition. He has 8 years of positive media coverage among things like Fox News and the types of media that conservatives consume, which means that even if Ron DeSantis has a sort of late momentum shift in his favor, it will not be enough to be able to actually get a clean victory. It will not be enough to avoid the harms we tell you about a long, drawn-out, messy primary that hurts the whole party. And we tell you these harms very succinctly in a way that literally just doesn't really get much engagement with this affirmative team, that you make drag the primary out longer rather than having it end on Super Tuesday, that primaries are now messier, and there are 3 certain harms of this. Firstly, you lose out on a huge amount of your money because it gets burned on internal advertising spending for a primary rather than saving it up for the general election, which means that you have far fewer ads to be able to counter, attacks on your nominee in the general election. Secondly, we tell you that the primary means that people Trump and DeSantis have to get more conservative, right? Because of the structural nature of primaries, you are only appealing to people who are already self-selected as conservative, right? Which means even if they start off as moderate, the way you win a primary is by running further to right of your opponent within that conservative party. So even if you take them at their best and assume Ron DeSantis has a sort of moderate image at the moment, the fact that you have to spend 6 months convincing diehard Trump voters to support you instead means you are forced to become more conservative. You're forced to adopt more conservative policy positions, say more controversial right-wing nationalist, sexist, racist things, which means that over the long term, this makes you more unelectable if you believe that moderate voters are the most important thing, as this affirmative team tells you. But thirdly, we tell you the certain harm is your massive favorability losses because you have to run negative ads to convince your voters that the other candidate is worse than you, which means that you lose motivation from your base because they've now spent 6 months hearing ads from the other guy about why you suck. But those ads are also being able to be exposed to normal swing voters who have now also been exposed to enormous amounts of media about why one particular Republican candidate is terrible. All of those harms are certain, which means even if you have some doubts about characterization about which candidate is more moderate, which candidate is more likely to win, we explain you impose a certain set of costs upon yourself as the Republican Party if you do this that are almost certainly going to lose you the election. And that is the most important thing. That leaves us with sort of 2 scenarios in the debate. If you think Trump is going to win anyway, which we tell you is fairly likely, all of their benefits literally disappear. They don't have a quote unquote better candidate. They just have Trump, but they've now made him angrier. They've now wasted a bunch of money. They've now hurt everyone's favorability rating. All of our harms still add up. But let's take it at their best. Their case relies on the idea that Trump is going to lose, but I want to note that our harms still eventuate here. We tell you firstly, he's just likely to run as a third-party candidate. Note the affirmative team fucking concedes this. That literally means they can't win the debate, because if Trump runs as a third-party candidate and splits half of the Republican Party off onto this third party, that means obviously when the metric of this debate is the electoral success of your Republican Party, you're running in a first-past-the-post system. Obviously, that means your party is immediately crippled for a generation because you've now tanked the party, you've taken all of your donors, you've lost all of your votes to 2 different parties. Clearly, if you believe, as this affirmative team concedes, that Trump is likely to run third party, they cannot win the debate. But we explain that even if he doesn't, he's still going to attack the party. He's still going to carry some of his diehard supporters to stay home and dampen enthusiasm amongst Republicans. Let's talk secondly about the general election, because this is where this affirmative team had the vast majority of their case. The first push I want to address is the one that comes out sort of nearly at third affirmative, that it is important for the Republican Party to be able to cut off its baggage from Trump into the long term. But there are 3 problems with this. Firstly, the base likes this baggage. They like the fact that he's politically incorrect, that he speaks to their desires. That is why they are resistant to things like him being cancelled. That is why they continue to support him, despite the fact that liberal media and sensible civility politics and the people involved in that overwhelmingly reject Trump. They are not going to abandon Trump because of this baggage. Secondly, many of the elected officials and people with power within Washington, D.C. and state legislatures around the country got their start because of Trump. They are proudly Trump-endorsed candidates, which means that they obviously a lot of the Republican Party doesn't want to cut off this baggage. They like it. They're not going to do this, which means you get massive disunity within the party. But thirdly, I just want to know, even ignoring that and taking them at their best, assume that the Republican Party does genuinely try to cut off this baggage and wants to do it. They have a credibility problem because they've just spent the past 8 years telling the world that they love Trump, that they're going to stand by him no matter what. The 2020 Republican official policy platform was just, we support Trump. you cannot backflip on that in a convincing way that is actually persuasive. That baggage is going to stick with you no matter what. You are better off leaning into it. The second argument they make is about moderate voters in swing states, and it's better because Ron DeSantis is more nuanced. 6 reasons this argument falls, and with it, any chance of victory for them. Firstly, as I already mentioned, it's unclear that the party has any credibility. They've spent 8 years institutionally supporting Trump. You can't suddenly turn around and have people believe that you're actually more moderate, that you've recognized the error of your ways when you were so deeply involved in Trump's activities in the first place. Secondly, as we flagged, the baggage doesn't actually particularly hurt him. It was only because of COVID that he ended up losing in 2020, and only then by a margin of thousands of votes in a couple of swing states. He was still immensely popular. He still has a great deal of electoral capacity. Thirdly, we tell you that the likely Trump replacement of Ron DeSantis is also extremely far right, not just because of his evidence, which Charlie outlines in a second, about the fact that he passed a don't say gay law, which literally makes it illegal for teachers to be visibly gay in Florida public schools, but also for the structural reason that the primary running longer incentivizes him to become more right, because you don't get the Trump in the primary has to become more radical than Trump. Obviously, by their own metric, that means they lose. Fourthly, opposing Trump loses you a lot of people who are personally loyal to Trump and not the Republican Party at large as an institution. Things like white working class voters in the Rust Belt who were crucial in winning, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan in 2016. And you should weigh them more highly than moderates because they do things like volunteer for you. They donate to you so your campaign can function. They do get out the vote operations. Fifthly, you look disunited. I don't understand what third affirmative is talking about here. Obviously, if the party is split between 2 candidates, far more when half the party is endorsing one candidate, half the party is endorsing the other. That's far worse than just endorsing one candidate. You look like clowns. The Democrats have an advantage. But sixthly, you just need to weigh this against the certain harms we tell you. You burn your money, you get more negative attack ads, you get less enthusiasm, and Trump is going to keep attacking DeSantis no matter what. At the end of this speech, even ignoring the stuff about being third party, Trump is a better candidate than DeSantis. But even if he wasn't, the act of putting him into the position of the nominee is going to destroy your party forever. Vote negative.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to summarize the case for side negative, I'd like to invite the negative reply speaker here.
First question I'm going to ask in this reply is, who is more popular within the Republican Party, Trump or Ron DeSantis? This question is important because firstly, it decides your chance of picking a winner and having more unity within the party, which is obviously good for Republicans. But it secondly outlines on which side the campaign becomes longer, which both teams agree is bad for general election outcomes. What are their pushes here? The first was a set of policy issues that are not exclusive to Trump, things like abortion that we clearly deal with down the bench. The second is to try and assert that Ron DeSantis focuses on policy more, whereas Trump has more sexist rhetoric that people see through. The first response we give is to say that this is incorrect. Ron DeSantis is viscerally homophobic. He is more outspoken than Trump is in many instances. But secondly, Sam just gave you 6 reasons why this isn't true, or even if it was, it wouldn't hold true if the Republican Party tried to support it. The third push from them is to say, well, Trump lost in 2020. But we explained this loss was primarily due to the isolated incident of COVID, and it wasn't that by that much. But secondly, just many Republicans don't believe that he lost, right? The fact that there is a Stop the Steal campaign probably suggests that many of the voters still think he should have won that election. Compare that with our pushes, why Trump is vastly more popular. Firstly, we explained Trump has a much larger national platform within the party, but also much more influence over the media, which is super important for getting voters on side. So when they say things like attack ads are good, it is entirely contingent on them disproving this premise. Secondly, we explain independent of that, Trump just has more notoriety. People know his name from a larger portion of society. That means it's much easier to get a campaign going. Thirdly, we explained that actually Ron DeSantis' platform is not palatable to moderate voters. And this is important because it means that the Florida wins, the Florida red wave that they outline, isn't transferable to more broad election victories. But finally, we explained that Trump's most ardent supporters are often voters in swing states like the Rust Belt themselves. Those are the sorts of voters that Trump brings on side. So even if there was an equal amount, Trump has the more important ones. But I would note, independent of that question of who's more popular, there is a separate question in this point, which is even if Ron DeSantis is more popular, Trump is more likely to resist losing. There are a few reasons we explain for this. Firstly, because Trump has a revealed incentive to do this, right? That's why January the 6th happened. Second, because Ron DeSantis, conversely, has the incentive to appease the party because he is young and needs a future career. But thirdly, just because Trump has more, Ron DeSantis was nominally more popular, Trump is more likely to drag out the campaign, and Trump is more likely to undermine the candidate that you're your party selects. Second independent question, though, what happens with Trump's third party run if he loses the primary? Because I explained right back at first why he has both the incentive and the capacity to do this. The response at second is to say, well, this means you get a more unified party. But we clearly deal with that, right? It's a first past the post system, which means one Democratic Party will always defeat both of the two smaller Republican candidates, which means you have absolutely crucified any chance that you have of winning a general election. The final push at third affirmative to say, well, even if you lose, it's better to distance yourself from Trump. But we firstly weigh this, right? Winning elections is obviously more important. And it also allows you to change laws to cement Republican power in the future. But secondly, you can't distance yourself believably for reasons that Charlie and Sam explained. The Republican Party has been supporting Trump for 8 years. It comes off as incredibly disingenuous to try and go back on it and flip-flop now. But let's deal with the final push, which is if Trump wins the primary, because I would note affirmative just accepts at third, that if this happens, it is bad. And I would note that our impacts of this were clear and strong down the bench. So insofar as the outcome of the primary is relatively uncertain, that is, in your adjudication, you believe there's some chance that Trump wins, some chance that DeSantis wins, but it's maybe marginal either way, you should weigh this very highly, right? Because we prove certainly that the harms that will definitely happen if he does win that primary. So maybe there are marginal harms if he loses, but there are certain harms if he wins. You should weigh that as super crucial. That is why negative team has a clear margin in this debate.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for their speech. In order to summarize the case for affirmative and to complete this debate in general, I'd like to invite the affirmative reply. You're here.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, you could have credited the entirety of negative case if this debate happened before 2020. But times have changed. We've pushed you right from the start that the fact that Biden still holds a significant amount of power in the Senate and holds a significant chunk of seats in like the House of Representatives, and the fact that a focal point of his political campaign is severely anti-Trumpism, and we gave you layers and layers of analysis as to how this anti-Trumpism has happened and why it has impacted his primary campaign, we don't really understand where is this enormous Republican base that's coming from, because we've been very clear in showing you that the internal fracturing that already exists right now within the Republican Party is significant, right? The fact that there is a significant chunk of people who don't like Trump, who probably don't want him in power. Listen, we agree that there are probably going to be Trump acolytes who exist on both sides of the house who are going to support him anyway. But right now, due to the pushes of anti-Trumpism and the fact that he lost to Joe Biden, which it's inconsequential why he lost, but the fact that he did lose means that there is still a significant chunk of people right now who are already against him. Why was this important? Why you should weigh this heavily? Because we think that even in their absolute best case and our worst case, which is, let's say the Republican Party doesn't really do anything and lets things play out, even in that scenario, let's think about the political costs that the Republican Party has to incur. The fact that for all of the incentives that they say, that Donald Trump is extremely vitriolic. He has a lot of media control and he thrives on vitriolic rhetoric, right? Which means that given that we're able to reasonably prove to you that Ron DeSantis is going to be popular enough for Trump to take notice, which means that even if you don't do anything in their absolute best case, there's still going to be so much internal fracturing and disunity between the Republican Party, because Trump is going to engage in that vitriolic rhetoric against Ron DeSantis anyway, which means given that under our side, you would probably have the opportunity to stop that in the first place, because you could probably leverage the supporters that don't like Trump. You don't use that in and of themselves, which means you incur that enormous amounts of political cost under their side. Then what if Trump wins? Which means that in the most likely case, as they conceded, what if Trump wins? We think that in that scenario, the immense political cost of trying to defend the things that Trump are trying to say, the fact that he's saying the election is a scam, the fact that all the all the things he's saying about the great replacement, right? The fact that there are the fact that there are non-Americans who are trying to usurp white Americans from positions of power, right? You need to regardless of whether or not Republican the majority base of the Republicans believe in this or not, even if 90% of them do, you still need to defend that rhetoric against the Democrats to begin with, because they're going to attack you and they're going to use the same rhetoric and same tactics that they used previously to win against Trump. The fact that they're going to point the finger towards Trump and make him into a monster. Again, these are all analysis and impacting that came from second half, which wasn't responded to under their side of the house. But lastly and most importantly, we've given you lots of structural reasons as to how like Donald Trump long term probably isn't the best candidate to have, even if he has name recognition and a much wider voter base than Ron DeSantis, right? We've given you structural reasons as to how Ron DeSantis is probably isn't someone who is already pissing off his previous voter base the way Trump is, but more importantly, his unique brand of being more constructive and policy driven makes it much more difficult for Democrats to attack him in the first place, right? Which means that in the vast majority of cases, given that Democrats already know how to deal with Trump, we'd rather have a newer candidate using the resources that he already has right now to take away Trump and focus on that one candidate, which means in terms of political cost, you probably have like a significant amount of political cost in dealing with Trump now, but you don't have to deal with the baggage later down the road. Lastly, on the idea of Trump, having a third party, again, recognize that Trump having a third party is likely to be insignificant because we think that there is still a significant hurdle that he has to overcome to do it in the first place. That was a mechanistic leap that wasn't explained under their side of the house. Very proud to affirm.
All right, I'd like to thank that speaker for that speech, and I'd like to thank all of you for this debate. This completes the debate for the round. In that event, I'll just resume recording. So I'll go on to the call and then the specifics of what determined it. So we had a unanimous call in favor of side negative in this debate. So let's try to discuss what happened on the debate and on what grounds we gave the debate to side negative. So a couple of things here. What's good for Republican Party in the election? I think there were two factors that were identified at negative in regards to what's necessary. A unified Republican voter base, that means that less dragged out primaries campaign, and secondly, a popular candidate. I think side affirmative chose to deal with the second part of the claim by suggesting that Trump was widely unpopular candidate. So there were a couple of analysis that side proposition affirmative does to try to mechanize this. A couple of things here. Firstly, is in regards to Trump's volatility, in regards to how you cannot trust Trump with policies. Second, in regards to Trump's failures, for example, COVID, and a lot of ways in which Trump was voted out of power. Third, in regards to the kind of rhetoric that Trump uses being misguided as, like, for example, sexist, or probably appropriately guided as such in regards to how this alienates certain voter base who are enthusiastic about Donald Trump in the first. Also, I think larger things like media coverage of entire Democratic Party being anti-Trump as a smear campaign against the Trump also doesn't benefit the positioning of Donald Trump in that election. So I want to evaluate how these claims were refuted by side negative. So I think a couple of things here. Side opposition was able to suggest that there is a lot of internal power that Trump is able to yield in the electoral campaign. The power that comes from network that Trump has, the ability for Trump to self-fund himself, but also the fact that he holds significant power within the Republican Party once, because he was tested like some time back and has some kind of networks and connections with the existing Republican members. But also secondly, the fact that Trump is willing to go further than other candidates, for example, going through illegal means and covert maneuvers, even being okay with things like gerrymandering, a lot of the situations where it might seem unethical for any normal candidate, but Trump would go out and justify this. The fact is, would still get criticized, like side government said, but was able to go and do that, allowing certain kind of advantage to Republican Party in that position. The idea here is, when you actively oppose Trump, you alienate Trump and you lose out on these benefits that Trump can provide. For example, getting your judges in the Supreme Court, or probably a lot of other benefits that positions Republican Party more favorably, either on the eyes of voters, which I think is largely disputed, but rather on a more powerful system fight that is better. The second contest that proposition says was around alternatives. That is, one, DeSantis, but also other possible candidates. I think wasn't explored about the second fact. So mostly DeSantis and about the popularity in the campaign. So the analysis here is they were popular in Florida, and they were much more popular in Florida than how Trump was in general elections. So I think the analysis that followed was because this person was more rational with their policy making, but also more moderate compared to Trump. And that's why they're likely to be seen as more reasonable in negotiations, isn't going to be seen as like a public speaker who's like randomly giving out things that are bad and a lot of other stuffs like that. So I wanted to talk about a couple of things. Side negative is able to prove that the voter base on entirety of America is very diverse than the voter base in Florida. Second thing is, while the candidate can be seen as slightly more reasonable than Trump, it also leads to a lack of enthusiasm for people who come out to vote. So even if some people think of this candidate as reasonable and they are like thinking of their vote as more reasonable, but the fact that this candidate doesn't inspire confidence in rest of the people or within the Republican Party also means that the ability for people to turn out to vote and then change this is going to be limited. But the second fact is where side opposition is able to talk a lot more. In regards to talking about the success of Donald Trump, in regards to actual benefits in terms of economics, but also in terms of what people can actually realize, because Trump never fails to go out and criticize his opponents, but Trump never fails to go out and talk about his own victories. He does it through media channels. He does it through many different places. For example, positioning of how US economy was in Trump's time, but again, at Biden's time, in regards to probably the effects of inflation and a lot of other things. So this does a couple of things. One, I think while Biden is still likely to launch an anti-Trump campaign when Trump runs for the election, this campaign is also likely to be less effective, given the fact that Trump also has other other powerful mechanisms to refute that. The idea is in regards to comparisons with his own presidential campaign, but also in regards to comparison with what's happening right now and why that's bad in regards to a lot of like Ukraine-Russia crisis and a lot of failures in regards to that. The second thing that proposition does is in regards to expanding the value of that alternative as a candidate against Donald Trump. I think there is slightly less mechanism. The only analysis here is the personality of that person. But I think opposition didn't really contest personality until second up, right? The major contribution there was capacity. The question was, this candidate isn't as capable as Donald Trump. The reason for that is the access to funding, but also the popularity within the party that is necessary for you to get that kind of support to win either the primaries or after the primaries. So the second part is, I think in regards to if this person actually wins the primaries, and this is also where there was limited engagement on affirmative, while I would say that there was some engagement. So the idea here from opposition is this: Trump is a bad person, and Trump is going to get very angry at the point you actively criticize him or actively oppose him. What that leads to is Trump being able to run smear campaign, either run as an independent candidate who is able to actively criticize all existing candidates using all existing platforms that he has, or secondly, dragging out the primary in a way that makes it unhealthy for Republicans. The reason is because you have a lot of ads and a lot of other targeted attacks against other campaigners, other like election candidates, and that also leads to more and more negative press about Republican Party, and that limits the ability for them to succeed on elections, alternative to a Democratic Party, which is slightly more unified on Biden. So on this, proposition says a few things. This is likely to occur on both sides, which I believe, like definitely, because if you support Trump, maybe alternative, currently I think it's Ron DeSantis, but also other people, whoever might run, will still run in the election, and Trump is going to do that regardless of what. The question was, I think side opposition was able to flip this claim in certain point, was suggesting that when Trump is shown to have like a really reasonably high amount of support, then it's more likely that the other candidate will give up and then offer the support to the Trump. The idea is, even in instances where it's unlikely, there are two things that can occur. Trump dragging out the election, which is bad on both instances, that already fractures the Democratic Party. But once Trump doesn't win, Trump going out and fighting as an independent candidate, which again increases the capacity for Donald Trump to defame the candidate again. That means even more limitation in regards to the access to electoral results for if you go with other campaigns. The idea then was, but Trump has done so many bad things,
And that is why it is better for yourself to distance from Donald Trump. So you can go on and suggest that Trump was a bad candidate. We took him out, so please vote for us now. And I think this is a reasonable way to go forward. But the idea is whether the press will buy that. Side opposition says the press is rather likely to call you hypocritical. The reason for that is you supported Donald Trump for so many years, and now you are opposing them. And that also means that you are refuting your own stance on Donald Trump. And that's why it's going to probably reduce the popularity and legitimacy of party itself. Secondly, Donald Trump's election campaigns being targeted also means that your ability to put out this kind of message is going to be limited at the point Donald Trump is also able to independently fight as a candidate, and also that limits the ability for you to succeed in the long run as well. The next thing then is whether or not you are able to come out of this Trump fever, because proposition's focus on strategy here is suggesting that Democrats have prepared for Trump and they have not prepared for this candidate who is likely to succeed by seeing more reasonable. The idea here is this person is slightly more moderate than Trump. This idea is disputed by side opposition. They talk about Trump is racist, this person is racist and homophobic. But proposition's response is you can also be Republican, but by being reasonable with your voter base or by seeming to be reasonable. On this, I think the analysis there is the way in which Trump frames this kind of discourse around abortion is based on misogyny and patriarchy. And that is why Trump is really bad on this kind of dialogues because of those things. And alternatively, other people, for example, Rodi Santos, while might be homophobic and sexist, is able to reasonably frame that as a policy outcome as opposed to individuals being that. So I think a couple of things here. I think this was largely debated on both sides. I think both of the sides says oh, they are racist as well. But I think what's likely to believe is Trump is more likely to sensationalize these elements, and that's probably true as well. The fact is, I'm not exactly sure if it's the good thing for your case, because on a couple of reasons. One, yes, it increases your support from the moderates, but it reduces enthusiasm from the people who are likely to support you in the long run. The idea is this enthusiasm doesn't matter because they are going to vote for you anyway. That's the idea from affirmative. But the problem is side negative is able to emphasize that voting is not the only way in which these people can contribute. These are the people who are most likely to come out in campaigns and support for them. These are the people most likely to donate for the party and support them in financial ways, but also they are more likely to stay with you for a long run. And next important thing is, even if they would not vote for a Democrat party in any other way, they still have to vote, right? So the idea here is Trump is able to make them enthusiastic enough to be committed to this campaign, which is a benefit in on itself, because currently you can position yourself as a party that is exciting and also probably providing for the people. That is what side opposition was able to analyze. I think in regards to what it ended up being though, was around power and popularity of Donald Trump. Side opposition was able to prove that Donald Trump has considerable amount of power inside and outside the party. I think the outside part was disputed largely. The idea was because anti-Trump rhetoric, second, losing control on media, not being trustworthy, and a lot of other things. So I think this argument, in some sense, was very limited in regards to popularity outside the media. But I think within the Republican Party, but also how Republican Party would be able to organize media campaigns for Trump was something that was proven to a substantial degree on opposition. So even if it is true that there is going to be a lot of negative press surrounding Donald Trump, I think side opposition was able to say that this is a better press compared to an inexperienced candidate who is likely to get very limited press, and also alternatively, even if he gets press, isn't going to be taken seriously by the voters because they don't consider him like a really good candidate who knows a lot about other places. The reason is he's tested only in Florida and not in rest of the places, limiting the ability for people to just decide on the basis of data that they have. One, they don't know him mostly. Some of them might know him after this campaign goes forward, but the fact is they don't trust him as an experienced candidate. And similarly, Trump also has an incumbency bias, which allows for that to occur. The last thing is, I think they do explain a lot of Trump's responses by talking about Trump's personality as a narcissist. So for example, on opposition, they talk about how Trump is entirely defensive about his agenda, unwilling to negotiate, all of which means that the Trump's idea or Trump's approach to going against all of this is even more likely because of all of those claims. So yeah, that's basically it. Do you have any questions? Any of the teams? All right, I'll just stop the recording at this point. This is the end of OA.